All right, everybody, thank you so much for tuning in to today's live stream. And I really appreciate everybody coming in. We're going to try to keep these Ask Me Anything live streams just set up so that they're happening on Tuesdays. I know I'll be doing next Tuesday as well. And I know that's one of the questions that people have is what the dates are. I know I've occasionally moved these things around a little bit and had them on different days, but at this point in time, next Tuesday looks pretty good. I'm a little unclear after that just because I think the studio is going to be shut down, so I may try to see if I can experiment with some of the new podcasting equipment that was donated to me recently and see if I can maybe experiment with a couple other locations for some future live streams, maybe over the Christmas holiday kind of range at that point in time. A number of just real quick updates for those of you who are interested in this. I actually did an event where I was one of the speakers that was hosted by the Epoch Times, and it was kind of celebrating the 20th anniversary of the 9 commentaries on the Communist Party, which they had issued back in 2004. November of 2004, and I was there was actually quite a few speakers there that were native Mandarin speakers at that event. And then some of us were English speakers, but it was mostly focused on a Chinese-focused, Chinese Communist Party kind of focused angle. And of course, we were talking about this story, and then the abuse and failures of socialism, communism, and diversity, inclusion, equity, or whatever version of the isms that are currently being used to attempt to push Marx's failed ideas into current generations. And so it was really neat to be there with just a different audience that saw a lot of people there I knew, but there were also some people that I didn't know, so it was kind of fun to be in front of an audience of new people and a lot of very distinguished speakers, especially in the expat kind of community from China who had escaped communism, people who lived in America, and they're Americans pushing back against the communist influence of the Chinese Communist Party here in America. It was fun. It was good to be there. I was there on Sunday. It was a good event, and I definitely encourage those of you who are just kind of interested in some of the subject here. This is a good book to just get your hands on and look at some of the modern commentaries. For those of us who were more influenced in the fight for freedom and liberty kind of back more in the 80s or 90s and kind of my era, when at least for me, Road to Serfdom, Thomas Sowell, Bastiat's The Law, a number of different publications like that, I think were pretty impactful. But there's lots of people are engaging again, and you see a lot of ideological pushback again against the failures, the inevitable, predictable, certain to occur failures of socialism, because usually the typical history is that when socialism fails, the argument is it just wasn't tried as perfectly as it needed to be, and of course this time will be different. That's usually the argument. So once again, this is an Ask Me Anything event. So if you have questions that you want to ask me, feel free to just enter those down below. And what will happen is I'll give you an example of what it will look like here. And when I'm answering the question, you should be able to see it below in the screen, and you'll know at least what question initiated my response, even if I've gone off subject and gone into some other area. But so you should be able to hear or should be able to know what question I'm answering based on what you see there. Also, so just leave your comments there. If you can, try to say @We the Governed, because usually a lot of times when I'm doing one of these live streams, there's a lot of people commenting back and forth, which is fine, commentary that way, but it's a little bit harder for me to pull out the questions, and so it makes it a little bit easier for me to see it if you just say @We the Governed, just so I can pick it out of the background. Now, one of the funny things about the subject that I kind of had for today's live stream, and maybe funny is the wrong word, but I wanted to just bring up this whole recent jury decision out of New York City with Daniel Penny, and just the decision, the right decision by the jury, I think, to find that he was not guilty of either manslaughter or negligent homicide. I mean, it It was a ridiculous case where you had a person who was very clearly a Good Samaritan jumping in and trying to protect the other people on the subway. And Alvin Bragg, who's just got to be one of the worst district attorneys in America, who decided that that was the case that he was going to prioritize and prosecute rather than the many criminals and violent criminals that Alvin Bragg releases and that the police arrests that he doesn't put in jail at all or even bother to prosecute. He puts them right back on the street, rolling the dice, seeing if they can kill some other New Yorker or other people in the community. And that seems to be Alvin Bragg's plan. And then, of course, he goes after Daniel Penny, who very clearly was intervening in the way that he did to protect those people on the subway. It means a lot to me just because I went to college in New York City. So even though I'm a fifth-generation Washingtonian, I definitely spent 4 years of my life there riding that subway. This is pre-Giuliani, and so it was under the David Dinkins administration. So crime was horrific and far worse even than it is today. And just the confinement that you're stuck in when you're on the subway underground, and you could go to a stop and you have a crazy person that stepped on the train. I definitely had that happen to me. Anybody who's ever ridden the subway for any length of time in Manhattan, you would have some event of some kind, maybe not so much during the Giuliani era, but certainly pre-Giuliani and the post-Giuliani era, especially over the last few years now, you would definitely have experiences like that in the subway. And it's scary because you're stuck in this confined compartment. I mean, you can kind of leave the cars maybe to go to the car behind you, but if you got a crazy person in there's not a lot you can do until the next stop. Maybe you can get off the train then. And it's terrifying if you have somebody who's particularly violent or threatening to kill everybody on the train or whatever level of drama they're introducing. And you're super thankful. If you're a normal person, you're going to be thankful that somebody steps in and subdues that bad guy until the police can get there to arrest him. And you know, it's just absurd that the prosecutor in New York City decided that that was the case that they were going to go after. Guy deserves a medal not to be prosecuted, and I'm very glad to see that the jury in New York City found him not guilty. So that was a good thing to see, but still a torturous process for him to go through. And I know Daniel Penny went on media shows here recently, just talking about, hey, I would have felt I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I'd released him and then he'd gotten up and then actually killed or hurt somebody, not to mention that Mr. Penny mentioned that he'd obviously be in a pretty risky position himself because he was on his back restraining the violent felon who was threatening to kill everybody on the train or kill somebody on the train anyway. So it's just one of these stories. It kind of reminds, there's an element of the Rittenhouse case too, where it was so obvious that Rittenhouse was defending himself, and yet that's the case that these prosecutors were pursuing. The identical prosecutors who frequently leave violent criminals and they just unleash them back into the community with no penalties or any significant enforcement mechanism at all. So it's very interesting to see the impact, I think, on this case and the necessary rediscovery kind of the need to talk about being basically a Good Samaritan, and how important it is to have Good Samaritans in our society, and to not, if you're going to have a functional society, and to not basically discourage people from being Good Samaritans. We want more Good Samaritans, not fewer Good Samaritans. And whenever you have a prosecutor who's out of control like Alvin Bragg, you're simply encouraging more people to look the other way and just let people become victims of crime all around them. So that's the kind of thing that the jury made the right decision out there in New York, but the bigger question is, why do we have a crazy prosecutor like Alvin Bragg out there doing things like this? So even San Francisco and some of these other cities are rejecting these crazy prosecutors, and it's probably about time that we really cleaned house on these soft on crime prosecutors and judges and anybody like that in that system who are so willing to roll the dice with our lives and our children's lives and our family members and neighbors' lives by releasing these violent criminals amongst us and not enforcing the law the way that it should be. So That was why I kind of mentioned that in the thumbnail that I put together in kind of the headline for today's show. And I did a video about that. I recorded 3 videos today that I'll kind of roll out over the next few days. That's going to be one of them. Hope to do that one as quick as I can, just discussing it in a little bit more detail. But that was, I think, a big deal and a significant issue. The other thing that happened over the weekend, I live in Thurston County, and which is, for those of you not from Washington State, you might be watching this video, Thurston County is the county that also happens to contain the state capital in the city of Olympia. So it's mostly a government town, or at least a big chunk of it's a government town, state government. And the Thurston County doesn't usually make the news for any good reason, and this weekend was no different. Thurston County Commissioner Emily Klaus made national and international news. I actually saw her picture and articles in the Indian Times. It was on Drudgereport. It was basically copied everywhere about the lawsuit that was filed against her in Thurston County by her former assistant for $750,000 for unwanted sexual advances or relationship that she had supposedly pushed on this guy. At least he's alleging that. And also it sounds like she took money from him, she borrowed money from him, never gave it back, some kind of lover's quarrel and spat, which, by the way, it's a violation of a variety of ethics laws. And, most people would get fired for being in this kind of a situation. You don't hire a subordinate and then have a relationship with them like that and then try to fire them when you break up after taking money from him. It's kind of crazy. Now, I don't think he's a good actor necessarily either, because it sounds like this is might be a shakedown operation that he's trying to run, but two wrongs are not making a right here, and 2 bad people aren't producing better outcomes. And in theory, I realize that she's probably the best that the Thurston County Democrats have to offer, but she's obviously a disaster and an incompetent clown to have in public office, and it's embarrassing to see people like that there. But that's how Thurston County gets on the map, and that's how Thurston County made Drudgereport. And you can go to the Thurston County official website, and you can see the linked human resource report, which they heavily redacted in a weird way. It's kind of silly because I don't know why they need those redactions on it. Everybody knows the names behind because of the lawsuit that's been filed, so it's kind of a pointless redacted report. And then also Emily's attorney, or looks like the person who kind of filled in for that role to do kind of her side of the report. But regardless, you got a lawsuit pending against the county, a silly and stupid lawsuit that was easily avoidable with just hiring people with some marginal level of an IQ that's above room temperature, and probably with just some adult mentalities that don't seem to exist. Weirdly enough, the other county commissioner, Ty Menser, seems to have enabled this behavior and encouraged it more. Another Democrat on the county commission, and the only Democrat county commissioner is retiring this year, and so we're going to have some real challenges, I think, going into this next year or so, which certainly merited a more detailed discussion about the need for recruiting people that are adults, that have some level of sanity, and that are willing to actually come in and operate like adults in the Thurston County Commission, because majority of the Democrats there do not right now, which is too bad. And so it also highlights the ridiculous attacks that were imposed on Mejia, Commissioner Mejia, Carolina Mejia, because she's a Democrat too, but she's pretty reasonable, and she was standing up against Emily Klaus and clearly opposing her, because of the bizarre and weird behavior and a complete narcissistic sort of denial of, Emily was she's in complete denial about her part of this problem and the role that she played to put Thurston County at risk and to do the foolish things that she's doing. So unfortunately, it's probably not going to get any better anytime soon. But sometimes, when you let clowns, don't be surprised when county government turns into a circus. As I mentioned in the video that I'll be launching on this, it is important, though, that you still there's basic functions of government at the local level that really are critical. Law enforcement, prosecuting criminals, even though Prosecutor John Thunheim probably doesn't do enough of it. The judges that in Thurston County Court Superior Court is known as the place where the state constitution goes to die. But despite that, and despite how terrible the judges generally are, there's still some basic process processes that they're up to the ability to process, right? Just doing traffic tickets and misdemeanors and kind of just processing basic processes in the court system. That you still need to have that. You need to have a roads department that's plowing the roads when it snows and putting the de-icer on the roads and fixing the pavement and taking down the weeds and checking the bridges and making sure they don't collapse. There's a couple of functions in government that we want somebody sane and normal in those positions. I do believe that the county manager right now is a pretty good guy. I feel bad for him for coming into a local government with, again, clowns is the nicest term I can possibly use for describing just how bad some of these elected officials are. But, I'm sure we'll find out some of the stories. I'm going to mention this another little thing. I mean, if you actually look at, there was the city of Boston city councilwoman who's being investigated for fraud and corruption and it's essentially a public integrity case out there. Essentially, she did the same thing Emily Klaus did in the sense of hiring a subordinate and then extracting money from that subordinate for yourself. And so you're getting public gain from that subordinate. And Emily Klaus did the same thing. What keeps Emily Klaus, the commissioner, out of a federal investigation or lawsuit is that the dollar figure. The feds won't step in those cases unless it's more than $5,000 under their statute. Now, they usually don't want to step in at and arrest every small-time politician that steals $5,000 or more. If they did that, the prison would probably be filled with those people, and it would really bog down probably the FBI. But at least that's kind of the cutoff and the threshold. And Emily didn't steal enough money or from her subordinate to reach that threshold. So instead, you're just going to have this argument about he said, she said. There'll be some issues with the money too, but it's just why are we dealing with this? This is just such a clown commission. But that's how they made Drudgereport. Thurston County's been really good at getting on national news when we do really stupid things, and that's how we got on it this time. So we got a lot of questions. We've got some questions starting to pop up, and so I'm going to start getting into some of these questions. But feel free to ask me anything. That's what this is, and we can jump right into it and see what you have to say. And let's get started here. We will start here with Rex. And Rex has a question here. Glenn, as the crime statistics are showing us the excessive increase in all sorts of crimes, do you think that it's time for the respective punishment for crimes that should be increased also? And that's a good question. I mean, we're really going back to kind of a 1990s question that had been raised really late 80s, early 90s, when minimum sentencing laws and some of the other requirements, 3 strikes and you're out, which was an initiative in Washington State, 94, I want to say that's when it came through. We were the second state in America to pass an initiative like that. But and that was John Carlson who actually ran that initiative back then, or who took point on it. And what's happened is this social justice warrior kind of world, the wokester world, the effort to come in and release violent criminals using any excuse you can find and launching them back into the community. We're in one of those waves again. And by the way, it's not the first time. Our state and our country has actually gone through a wave like this in the 50s, kind of coming out of the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, where they were super soft on crime then too. And then, no surprise, just like it happens every single time in human history that this is tried, then violent crime starts increasing because, after all, there's no penalties, or there's less likelihood of you getting any serious penalties. And so if the penalties go away, you're going to have an increase in crime. Clearly, people still commit crimes. Even when the penalties are severe, you're just going to have a lot fewer crimes, which is kind of the point. Also, putting people in jail means that they can't create new victims. And if there's one thing that we've seen with this modern left now and this effort to defund the police, to eliminate jail sentences, to downgrade the violent sex offenders violations, so if they're a major sex offender, then trying to drop that violation down so that you can give them parole to put them back in the community. And this just bending over backwards trying to help violent criminals, getting rid of bail, all these other things. the one thing they do seem to not care about or not be focused on is the fact that they create more victims. And this sort of demeanor and attitude means that they are creating more victims all the time with their terrible policies, and that the people running these institutions are pushing these programs, or the NGOs that are running these operations to make crime pay and to convince people to be criminals and to ensure there's no consequences for their violent actions or their crime. Those people clearly don't care about the victims that they create, whether that's children being harmed, or so often it's the most vulnerable people, or at least a larger segment of the victims tend to be more vulnerable people in the community, and there's clearly no concern for those people at all. And that's being reflected in the policies you see here. I don't believe one of the other challenges to look at this, and I would encourage people to dig into this a little bit more where you live, is to see if there's a movement, because I think in some of these cities, they're also, they being the left-leaning kind of administrative state folk that are involved there, and the people who are oftentimes trying to downplay the actual significance of the crime wave that is going on. I mean, you have to be foolish not to think it's been going on, especially in the last 5 years. And so trying to downgrade crimes, taking violent assault and trying to mark it down to a much lower level so that it makes your crime stats look better, is a terrible ideologically driven deception in the statistics in the first place. And it's one of the things that came up on the national stage, where the FBI was reporting crime stats that were manipulated and not accurate. Not all of it was their fault. Some of it was because major cities, left-leaning cities, just weren't reporting any of their crimes, and the crime stats weren't being reported accurately, so they weren't being fed through the FBI crime database. And so the data was misleading. It made it look like some crimes were dropping. And of course, when they corrected that during the presidential race, this became part of the political campaign, where suddenly the stats that were corrected. It turns out, yep, they are still going up. It has been worse at times in the past, but we're rapidly approaching that late 1980s, early 1990s violence levels in a lot of places. And what solved the problem back then, I still believe, was that basically the mandatory minimum sentencing laws and putting people in jail. And it isn't so much about reform. It's about protecting victims, which seem to always be forgotten in this restorative justice sort of attitude that the left is pushing down our throats once again, just like they did before. It's failed every single time it's done, and it's failing again right now, and they're creating more victims, and I hope that we're able to roll that back. But it's a long road back once you've gone down this path, especially when you have really bad prosecutors, soft judges, and this whole established class of non-governmental entities that seem to be focused on trying to promote criminals and pretend like they're not creating the victims that they clearly are. Obviously, it's been ironic, and we've had some stories about this, about some of the anti-police activists down in San Francisco having all their stuff stolen. When somebody stole, I think it was a U-Haul down there, and this activist who had been really leading the charge to defund the police. And then she suddenly discovers that nobody's getting back to her with her stuff, and there's not enough police to follow up on it. And so everything that she cared about or wanted, it's all gone because they stole it from her, just like she had encouraged the very environment, by defunding the police and reducing criminal penalties, and therefore turning San Francisco into a mecca for criminals. They've done the same thing in Seattle. They've done the same thing in other cities, Denver. They've done the same thing around the country, and they're paying the price for it. New York City right now certainly is. So we'll just have to see how it goes and where things go from here. Linda Connor, you got a question here about, has anyone looked into the Department of L&I and medical malpractice? Well, that's interesting, because medical malpractice, I'm not really totally sure how Labor and Industries addresses medical malpractice specifically. You have a couple different angles. Obviously, I think there are some L&I rules that apply to hospitals, of course, and the practice of medicine generically. But I always thought most of the supervisory role was more from the federal side of things. rather than L&I, other than L&I's restriction on what gets reimbursed or what can't, and some of that. So I'm not sure the element of medical malpractice in the Department of L&I. If you have a update or a clarification on that question, please put it in down below. I haven't looked at it, so I'd be curious to know if maybe other people have as well. Let's see. Jason Fisher's question here. Howdy, Glenn. Will Washington state government follow natural gas law, or will it be struck down on a single subject, unlike I-1639? Good question. I believe that there's litigation obviously on it right now over the natural gas law. And for those of you who don't know, it was the Initiative 2066 that did pass. The people passed it after collecting the signatures early this last year. It was actually an initiative to the people, first thing on the ballot, and it passed. And people said that they want to have natural gas. Now, of course, the Democrats and the government believe that you aren't allowed to have natural gas. I say Democrat leadership because obviously a lot of Democrats voted in favor of this initiative because they want to have that flexibility or options moving forward. It's common sense, which means that the Democrat leadership opposes it almost every time. And so what's happened now is the special interests who are trying to eliminate natural gas, of course, are going to fight over this. And government itself, I mean, the thing that really affects it more than anything else is going to be probably some building code rules and some of these little less noticed entities or agencies that basically exist to deter, setting codes or requirements for building or neighborhoods, and those are the entities where probably this fight is really occurring. And whether they're deciding we're going to require you to put in natural gas lines, even if people decide they don't want it, at least it's in the roads. You don't have to dig up the road to get it there. And those entities and some local cities and counties that have gone down the yellow brick road of decarbonization. They're the ones where probably this fight is really going to occur more than anything else. So we'll just have to see it. There's another question here. Scully, a good question here. Once you're acquitted of charges that have ruined the life and job, can he turn around and sue the prosecutor's office for monetary compensation? Okay, so this is a good question. And I don't have the specific answer for New York City. I do know that under the Good Samaritan laws of Washington State, and to be more clear, the specific laws that apply to, they really aren't, they're considered kind of Good Samaritan, but they aren't specifically the Good Samaritan law that we think of. When people say Good Samaritan law in Washington, they're usually referring to, and I did a video on this, that I included this in the video where I just don't have the statute memorized, but it's under Section 4, but it's basically a statute that it deals with providing like CPR and medical intervention where you're voluntarily trying to help people in a difficult situation, and you're immune to civil and criminal prosecution unless you did something that was egregiously out of control. So for the most part, that's how you're protected there. There's another part that people have oftentimes lumped into the Good Samaritan laws. That's RCW 9, I think, I don't remember the rest of the citation there, but I did put it up in the video that I'll launch. And that one deals with being immune for prosecution if you are coming to the aid of a police officer. I had an uncle that did this. A family member. Anyway, I have a huge family, so there's no way that even narrows it down much. But anyway, I had a family member that came to the intervention and helped protect an officer who was being attacked by two violent felons that he'd pulled over on the side of the road in Paulsbo a couple years ago. And so there's a specific statute that applies in that case that's basically giving you a certain level of immunity so that you can both be remain anonymous, but also not be held, that people can't sue you or charge you with anything if you've stepped in to help an officer who's clearly in need of help. The other one, though, is really more about the use of lawful or the use of force in lawful settings. One of the statutes that I referenced there also talks about how if for some reason a prosecutor comes after you as a citizen and you've used lawful force to defend yourself or to defend somebody else, because that's really in the same statute. You clearly have a right to self-defense, but there's also this right to defend somebody else, either a stranger or family or somebody else, and you intervened and you shot somebody or you killed somebody or you did something, you injured somebody, a bad guy who was committing a crime, and for whatever reason you have a prosecutor that's as bad as Alvin Bragg out of New York City, and they come after you and then they lose the case. The jury says, no way, this was clearly legitimate, lawful use of force. In Washington state law, that prosecutor, their office, the taxpayers essentially, or their insurance company, they have to pay your defense costs. And I don't know if there's punitive costs. It isn't specified in the statute, but they definitely have to pay all your legal costs and everything associated with that. I do believe that if a prosecutor is substantially out of line on that, then there's probably other litigation that you could bring against that prosecutor, because if it was a political prosecution or they did something like that, but now we're stretching into an area of the law that I'd be less familiar with. So, but it is very clear that, and it was set up this way to discourage pointless litigation over clear self-defense cases like the Rittenhouse case or like the Daniel Penny case out of New York, where somebody clearly was trying to help the fellow citizens on the subway, and a prosecutor comes after him, the prosecutor loses. Now in Washington state, that prosecutor would have to pay 100% of all your legal costs and make up for that. So at least that's how it's written in state law. So I don't know about New York. We'll have to see. Tony Freshy, did you hear about what AOC said about Daniel Penny? No, and I don't follow her that much. So, but she's a loon, so it's usually entertaining to see the kind of the facade that's there. I do hope that she becomes head of the Democrat Party and that she's their lead political candidate in a few years. I think that she would probably be one of the most effective people at destroying the left that the left's ever created in recent times. So we'll just have to see. Brian B. at We the Govern, did I see something Washington, ? Possibly unrealized capital gains in Washington? I'm assuming you're asking whether there's a law in Washington about unrealized capital gains. And I don't think that, I'm not aware of that. Now, it doesn't mean we're in silly season for a few more weeks, a few more months, up until January. And what happens is they propose all kinds of stupid bills. One of the things to remember is you can't, it's worth it to see ridiculous bills that are filed in the legislature. So this is the time when you do early filing on these pieces of legislation. So if you're going to work with a legislator to file a bill, you want to do early filing just so it's in that list. So good bills get filed now, bad bills get filed now, and a lot of loony bills get filed this time as well. And what happens is some of them are just virtue signaling bills. There's no real intention by the sponsors or anybody even who signed on to it to let it go anywhere, because they know the idea is so stupid and bad that it'd be ridiculous. And so they're simply doing it to pacify a donor or maybe some group of crazy activists or something. And so you have a lot of these loony ideas that get proposed as bills, but they really don't go anywhere. Maybe they get a hearing again for the same reason, just to make it seem like they care. The Democrats control all the committees, so they can get a hearing on pretty much anything they want. The Republican proposed bills, usually the Democrats will let them have a couple, of their bills, but mostly the Democrats control the process, so they can do kind of whatever they want as far as keeping legislation moving forward in Washington state. I don't remember seeing that one. It doesn't mean that idea isn't somehow out there, but it's really not gained that much traction, and I would say after this recent election cycle, it's disappeared off of the radar for most people. So we'll have to see. I'm not aware of that being it's one of the stupidest ideas out there, because trying to tax people on unrealized capital gains, it's not like they give you a rebate when that disappears the next day. So I just don't see that happening. There's a point here about give Penny qualified immunity, and I think that that's the whole point of having a Good Samaritan law in the first place. Essentially, that's what it does. And in Washington state, but I thought New York was this way too. You essentially do have the right to intervene to protect people on behalf of other people, and so it is a Good Samaritan activity. Night Wolf, I'm jumping down to you mainly because your comments are accurate here, and I just happened to catch them. the prosecutor wouldn't pay for the damages, the taxpayers would. You're right. This is something that actually, if I was to add a little bit of teeth to that piece of legislation, I would make it for every time they come after somebody who's clearly a self-defense case. So, because this actually doesn't happen in Washington State, this doesn't happen a lot. There was a case out of Lewis County a few years ago where a prosecutor did this and they lost. And the prosecutor, not only did they have to pay back the guy that they were harassing about it, he had intervened, and it was an edge case in some ways. He'd intervened and stopped a criminal who was breaking into his neighbor's house because his neighbor had asked him to watch the house, and he ended up having to shoot this criminal. And the prosecutor down there decided to prosecute the guy. The jury in Lewis County threw it out and said the guy wasn't guilty. And that prosecutor lost his reelection the next cycle, as he deserved to in that case. There was also a Skagit County prosecuting case where that was a self-defense case, so it wasn't a Good Samaritan case. And that was another one that they lost. But I remember I knew the guy who had been involved in the shooting, and it was just torturous and terrible for him to go through that process. I'm not sure if the prosecutor up there, I think maybe the prosecutor survived that, but it was definitely a case that shouldn't have been prosecuted as well. But you're right, the taxpayers are the ones who are on the hook. And just so you know how that typically works, the county or the city typically has insurance. And so what really happens is they're part of the risk pool insurance. And if it's a big, expensive case and you're a small jurisdiction, then it's probably more money than you have in reserves. And so your insurance pool is covering it. And then your insurance rates go up. And so the taxpayers are really paying higher interest rates, or higher insurance rates for the most part. This is what happens. When Thurston County was losing a lot of stupid land use laws in the past, and Thurston County was so bad that Thurston County was almost got kicked out of the risk pool because 6 of the top 10 major judgments were against Thurston County in that risk pool that they were in, which was like 29 counties and cities and other jurisdictions. And so Thurston County was becoming this net anchor. And so the other risk pool members wanted to kick Thurston County out for a while. And so it took some time for Thurston County to survive that process, but they did have to pay a lot more. And ultimately, the taxpayers paid more. So we'll see how it goes. The Andrea Kay, the Spokane City Council, is asking the legislature for permission to pilot a new way to tax property, a land value tax, where you're taxed on the value of your land only. Thoughts? The devil's in the detail. I wouldn't trust anything coming out of Lisa Brown's city of Spokane. She's the mayor out there, former head of Department of Commerce, former state senator, and a completely corrupt human being in every measurable way. So I can't imagine that anything good comes from recommendations that she has. So if they're asking for this, that's usually because they believe they can get a lot more taxes from it. Just a little secret sauce recommendation. You can't go out and I've never seen government do this where they say, hey, I know, let's collect fewer taxes by going down this tax path. I've never seen the deep state bureaucracy or any of these other people push for those kind of policies. I've seen elected officials who come in on a pro-liberty and freedom-oriented process looking at ways of cutting taxes or freezing them or downsizing the expenditures. I've seen that happen. But I've never seen the bureaucracy push for any kind of a tax idea that's going to actually reduce how much tax dollars they collect. So and the city of Spokane is not run by good people right now, so I can't imagine why they would be asking for something that they don't think is going to extract a bunch of extra cash. Let's see. James Ford, have you noticed that as they are being soft on crime, they will charge a Good Samaritan rather than the actual criminals? Yeah, that was kind of my point of the video that I did about the Good Samaritan laws and what's going on in Washington State. Not so much our state, sorry. I have to be fair about this because what happened in New York, I am not familiar with it being applied that way in Washington State. That being, because we may have stronger Good Samaritan protections here, actually, and better self-defense laws, too. It looks that way to me, but maybe I'm wrong. However, it's a question of priorities, and New York has made the news lately, as being a city super soft on crime, eliminating cash bail, never send anybody to jail, just put them right back out on the street. And in this way, they're very much like New York of the late 1980s, early 1990s, when I lived there. And crime was substantially higher in New York City then than it is now. The murder rate, most obviously, was substantially higher back then. And if you're a Good Samaritan and you decide to step in, I don't know how. I mean, I think that they were prosecuting Good Samaritans that way a little bit back then, but certainly under Giuliani, things changed a lot. And, generally, just judging from the way the jury responded, even the jury, as corrupt as the judge was and the prosecutor, and all the pressure and influence that probably came on these people, including the crazed BLM and nutjob leftist activists there that were probably threatening them, they still said not guilty, and that's pretty impressive. So anyway, and that's the challenge that we have there. Let me go down. There's a question right here. We need the AG to cover our legal fee costs when they come after us regarding rights that fall under the 2A. Yeah, and I mean, I'm going to tell you, there's some interesting dynamics, Donald. You raise an interesting question here. And it's not a question that you're actually asking, but I'm going to use my bully pulpit here to just kind of jump in on this. I think that there's things that you can build into the statutes and the laws that reduce the reflexive tendency of abusive, local DAs or maybe even an attorney general to abuse citizens under, who do defend themselves from criminals, or who perhaps, as Daniel Penny, serve as Good Samaritans coming in and protecting their neighbors. Washington State doesn't actually have that kind of history as much of abusing people like that. I'd like to see some examples where they did, but generally we just seem to have stronger protections on that from what I've seen. But when it comes to the Attorney General, say, coming after our Second Amendment rights, or First Amendment rights for that matter, or Fourth or Fifth, right, any of these other protections that we have, any of our property rights, it should be mandatory that the state has to cover your costs when they lose. And that, I think, would reduce some level, certainly the more marginal cases, a little bit, because even though the taxpayers are on the hook and the individuals involved in the abusive process don't seem to have a personal cost associated with losing, there's still a reality where their budget gets affected, and it reduces their maneuvering room in the future for whatever their aspirations are. So they're less likely, I think, to abuse people if you have something like that built into the process. Yeah, and this is a great question. Night Wolf, you brought this one up. Same thing I kind of mentioned, but if they're going to tax unrealized gains, they're going to cover unrealized losses. And the answer to that, of course, is no. And the whole thing's absurd in the first place, and it's one of the reasons why they shouldn't be doing that. Why do you think the 18th District flipped first time in 30 years? Is it because of all these apartments being built in Battleground? Well, I mean, sometimes you're going to have, depending on where those apartments will be built, that could change the demographics a little bit in your community. I also think the 18th is very close, and it's been close there for decades. Frequently, and you got to remember, it was redistricted again as part of the litigation over the Eastern Washington district, that the Democrats said that Republican Hispanics weren't real Hispanics and that only Democrat Hispanics counted as Hispanics. And so that argument, because we truly have some of the worst judges that humanity's ever been able to scrape together off the bottom of the barrel and throw in a black robe, that was the rationale these judges got. But that redistricting effort, the desperate effort to do that redistricting effort in Eastern Washington, affected about 12 districts, mainly because each ledge district, just like a congressional district, needs to have proportional representation, which means that whatever the number of people that live in Washington State gets divided, or the voters in Washington State gets divided 49 ways. We have 49 districts. Each district needs to represent the same population. So you'll have geographically really big districts in eastern Washington because of a sparse population, and very small districts in city of Seattle where you have a concentrated population. And in theory, the boundaries of each of those districts need to be about the same, and therefore the representative, both the legislative House of Representatives, which there's 2 of those from each of those districts, and the 1 state senator, which is also attached to that district, that they have proportional representation as any other state senator or any other representative. And that was a problem. Big fight in Washington state. Took them about 100 years, give or take, to sort all that out. If you go back and you look at the history, these were fights that the citizens of Washington state fought about a lot, because you had lopsided districts where sparsely populated, low population districts that had a lot fewer people both living there and voting had the same equal representation in Olympia as districts with a lot more people, a lot higher participation, a lot more intensity, and they were treated the same, when the reality is the intention was to divide the districts just like they do with Congress, where each district is proportional to the others. And so it took them a long time to sort that out in our state. And now the way the Democrats and these NGOs and some of these other groups have gone down, it seems like they're really trying to upend the idea of having an efficient redistricting commission, and one that's even remotely honest. So we're going back to the bad old days of the early 1900s, when these arguments were endless and repeated in Washington state history. It is kind of an interesting history if you care about it. Pretty wonkish, but still it matters, and that's how they're going. Let's see, Nightwolf, that's how the state is going to make up for a budget shortfall, raising property taxes until we're priced right out of our homes, and then profit on the auctioning of the property. Actually, this is not going to be how the state does anything. Most of the property tax discussions that many of us, and the battles that we're having around the state, involve local government. They're not typically involving the state government, because property taxes, the state gets a portion of it. Most of it just gets filtered straight into the schools. That's the theory. And so the way the general fund, most of those property taxes, the way it funnels in is that's where it's going. However, what you're really seeing is counties and cities raising it to make up for their own problems and shortfalls and incompetence. And they're the ones that raise the property taxes or the sales tax locally if they're trying to close whatever perceived budget gap they have. The state really, even for the size of a budget gap that they have right now, they could get by a year without having to raise any taxes, because they do have a reserve fund. Now, nobody wants to dive into the reserve fund too much, because it kind of eliminates the shock absorber sort of nature of having a reserve fund in the first place. But bad economic policies, which Ferguson's likely to continue, isn't going to encourage further development or economic growth. Plus, probably doesn't help that Boeing's laying people off, and that neither Microsoft nor Amazon are necessarily on this massive upswing right now. Now, they may end up being there, but they aren't right this minute. So, and new businesses are looking at Washington state with the capital gains tax and some of these other foolish policies, and they're just deciding not to come here, or some of them are leaving. And so this shortfall that the state has in its budget right now is going to only get worse, and it won't matter what the property taxes, some of these raises that are occurring in other counties around the state, it will not close that gap. It might close the gap for local counties. One of the things to look at when you look at a county government typically, and these numbers roughly apply also to city government, and it's worth looking at this, is what do they spend their money on? So the average county in Washington state typically spends, and it doesn't matter whether it's a small county of Asotin or the Leviathan of King County, typically they're spending somewhere between 85 and maybe 90% of their budget on public safety. And I'll define that. It's law enforcement, which is obvious. It's the jails, if they have them. It's and even if they don't, they're paying for it one way or the other. So it's still lumped into the public safety budget. The public defender's office, which is usually a separate item and a separately budgeted sort of activity that each of the counties or cities will have, depending on how they're structured. And then you have the judiciary, right? The courts, the prosecutor's office, and all that. And all that's kind of lumped under public safety. Now, the average county will also do what they call supplanting budgets, which is where you'll have like a road budget that is truly separate, and that actually does come in. Some of it's federal funding, filtered through the state, mostly on gas tax revenue and other things. And so that fund will sit over here. And one of the sneaky things, and I do think this is sort of dishonest the way they've done it, but it's legal, is that the law enforcement will say, okay, in Thurston County, the sheriff's office will say, listen, we are enforcing public safety out there on these roads and speed, traps, going to accidents, whatever. And we need to have $3.5 million to cover our costs, and that should come out of the roads fund. So rather than repairing roads or building more roads with that extra money, it should go into law enforcement. And okay, there's an argument for that. However, what poorly run counties will oftentimes do then is they essentially remove that $3.5 million in that example from the sheriff's budget in the first place, or at least cut it back substantially, and supplant it with this money that they've taken from the roads fund. And then they use that extra money that they didn't let the sheriff have as their slush fund for their NGOs and their kickback schemes and grant grifting operations, whatever it is they're running there. And so that's kind of how it goes. Sorry I got off onto like a local budgeting segue, and I'm simplifying it. I know it's not as simple as I'm representing, so I'm trying to simplify it for the need of just being able to discuss it in a relatively simple process. Jason, question: how did Washington get into budget shortfall, and where did all the money go? Well, keep in mind, what we had about $19 billion surplus cumulative surplus over a number of years. State budget's gone up, almost doubled, I think, in 10 years. I think I'm right on that. I might be off by a year or so, but it's roughly doubled. It's certainly doubled from the time when I first started looking at the budget back in 2010. So the state budget has gone up substantially. The biggest, there's two big pockets of money that Washington State squanders. First is education. That's their big chunk of change. It goes right into the education budget. And remember, at the state level, you have you have a capital budget, which is allocated differently for permanent projects, different kinds. It's a longer conversation to what that is. You have the general fund, which is what most of the money that you're thinking about goes into, and then you have this transportation fund. And those are the three budgets that the state legislature and the governor ultimately has to approve or sign off on, is those three pockets of money. And transportation is really separated because of the involvement of the federal government in how the fund gets collected and how it gets spent. So a little bit of history. There's a lot of history on that and why they do it, but that's how it's set up. So anyway, what you have is a lot of unserious people in government in Washington State. They really haven't had to cut their budget. I want to say it was 2009 and 10, if I remember right. It was before Inslee came in. So Inslee's never had to cut a budget. But Gregoire, the previous governor, she had to cut budgets a couple times. And if you remember what happened in 2008, you actually had the whole collapse of the real estate market, and then all of the cascade effect that occurred on that. And that really genuinely did cause a dip in income to the state, less taxes that they could collect at the state level. And so the state, for the first time in a long time, really had to actually look at themselves and say, hey, we have to cut our budget a little bit. They delayed it as long as they could, and then they had to make some cuts. And so Gregoire was forced to do cuts in the budget. So I remember Thurston County was too. So there were impacts that some local governments felt back then, but since then there's been no cut of any significance in any budget. Now, one of the problems you have, just like with the federal government, is we don't have zero-based budgeting, which we should have. Meaning that you need to justify that expenditure every year and not just presume that because you spent it last year, it's justified as a baseline level of spending for this year. And the question is, how much can you increase it? And it's one of the games they play, pretending like they're shaving the budget by saying, oh, well, we spent $20 million and they wanted to spend on this sub-component of the budget. We want to spend $22 million, or they asked us for $22 million, and we said, you only get $21 million. You still spent $1 million more than you did the year before, but then they make it sound like they cut the budget by $1 million and they didn't. And these are the games that I think that people will play. And that's a real challenge when you're dealing with the budget, because the last thing a bureaucracy is ever going to come and say is, "Hey, we'll willingly cut our requirements." Here, they're always going to look for any way to increase how much money they can extract before they start to cut their own budget. And part of it's human nature. It's not entirely evil. It's not necessarily a conspiracy. It's just the way people operate when they're running government. And so they're not going to willfully and cut government, which is actually one of the reasons why the whole Vivek and Elon Musk sort of approach to this Doge committee of cutting $2 trillion of the federal budget. Obviously, they aren't going to have any statutory authority to make those cuts, but they can make these recommendations. And if they've got political momentum, they can probably make a lot of the cuts. But even if they got rid of all 16% of the discretionary spending at the federal level, it doesn't come close to the $2 trillion they need to cut. They need to cut a lot of money from other places. And it's not as... it's going to just take a lot of grinding. They're going to hopefully hit all the easy stuff. Like, you should just stop funding all these NGOs. I can't see where that money's being spent well anywhere. And oftentimes the federal government's decided to outsource activities that they legally couldn't do themselves to hardcore leftist organizations called non-governmental entities, supposedly nonprofit, but they are making more profit than any of the for-profit companies out there. And they dump all this money into these entities. And I think cutting all of them off would be a good start. But again, even if you do cut them all off, you got a long ways to go. There's a lot more work that you have to do. At the state level, bloat is education is the biggest, and then usually the second biggest is DSHS, which is also, it's where the state will add money to all the welfare programs essentially that are run through the state. I know I'm simplifying it a little bit here, but essentially you have federal funds that come into the state, and the state administers those federal funds. DSHS is the primary vehicle through which those federal funds are administered to the public. And that's where you wash. It's like laundering money, right? So taxpayer dollars go back to D.C., and then they never have enough, so they always borrow. So you're putting your future generations into debt so they can send a big pile of cash back to your state so that you can distribute through these welfare programs. And the state will add money to that as well to enhance those programs as well. And so those are logically two places where you're squandering a lot of money. The Climate Commitment Act scam is clearly another way where you squander a huge amount of money and certainly don't do anything to help the people who live here. And so that's kind of how these shell games of the budget, it takes a phenomenal amount of energy and focus and determination to make cuts. And this is the problem that I have, I think, discussed a few times before, where you essentially have the distributed costs, concentrated benefits dilemma when it comes to managing government, which is that for the recipients of tax dollars, to them, those tax dollars are the greatest, most important thing they could ever possibly get in their life, because it's their lifeblood. That's how they survive. And so there's nothing they won't do. They will violate the law. They will threaten you. They will do anything and everything they can to keep the gravy train going. Because without it, there's nothing. Now, it's the average citizen distributed costs, right? Those costs are spread around a lot of people. And so the personal cost to you as a citizen for that specific task, or tax, I should say, that's going to that specific agency or that program, it's probably not a lot out of your pocket. It's cumulatively a lot because it's spread around a lot of people that are paying the taxes. And in your individual case, if you come in there and to cut that tax, you have to fight this epic battle with an entity that will do anything and everything it can to keep that cash gravy train coming. And now you're going to step in there and cut it off, but you're not going to get the benefits. Like, you're not going to save that much personally. The community might save a lot, but again, nobody individually is going to save that same amount. And so they increase the paying threshold so much for you as an individual trying to cut those taxes that nobody can come out and justify the energy and time that they put into doing this based on their own personal benefit. Brian Haywood's a good example of Let's Go Washington. There's no scenario ever in his future where he will ever earn enough taxes to actually justify how much money he put into running those initiatives to cut the tax rate. So even if they had been successful and they cut those taxes, he would never get that money back under any scenario. And so it's altruistic in the sense that you're doing it for the greater good of the community to help and cut these programs. And you can't possibly justify the hassle and drama you're going through and the money you're spending with a personal direct benefit in return. It's exactly the opposite for the recipients of that money. Concentrated benefits. To them, it's the greatest thing in the world. The most important thing in the world for them, and so there is nothing they won't do to try to, and including breaking the law and being dishonest and threatening you and stuff, to keep the gravy train going. So let's see. Night Wolf, yep, you talked about the Snohomish County. And by the way, it wasn't just Snohomish County, and it wasn't just Democrat-run counties. There's a number of Republican-run counties that should know better. But obviously, their elected officials are terrible, and they jacked up their taxes too. On property tax, which they shouldn't have done. And so we're dealing with, just the fallout of some of that, I think. Let's see. You also brought up another comment here. I'm going to address this as a comment, not a question. And I don't know why these questions don't seem to be popping up. Usually they slide up here more. So I'll try to make sure I'm covering these questions as you ask them. But Nightwolf, you're saying, hey, we need a type of electoral college like Nebraska and Maine have. Okay, so I'm going to address this. There's two parts to this. There's the federal side of what you're asking, and then there's the state side of what you're asking, and they're two different issues. Maine and Nebraska, so just so that people understand, it's a winner-takes-all on the electoral college thing for a state, meaning that if Trump wins Washington state, then Trump gets all 12 of the electoral college votes from Washington. So, big win for whoever wins Washington, you get all 12 of those points, or of those electoral college votes. So what Maine and Nebraska did, and this has been upheld by the Supreme Court as being legal, is they said, listen, we're going to distribute our electoral college votes by congressional district. They're relatively small states, and so they have 2 congressional districts, say. And so that means that they have 4 electoral college votes total, roughly. I'm just giving an example of how it works. And so one of those congressional districts votes for Trump and one votes for Harris, but the state overall goes for Trump because there's more votes in the Trump side than there is in the Harris side, for whatever reason. So in that case, then Trump gets 4, Harris gets 2. So 2 for the one congressional district that voted for Harris. And then Trump gets the 2 for the state, or for the congressional district that voted for him, and he gets the bonus 2 because he won the state overall. And the Supreme Court's upheld that as being legal. What you typically have is states that are controlled, where Republicans normally get the complete package of electoral votes. Well, the Democrats are going to want those to go down the Maine or Nebraska route. The states like Washington that get no Republican electoral votes, they would want to go down that route just so that we could give 2 or 4 or 6 to Trump, and then the other 6 would go to the Democrats. So it's kind of this bounce around, kind of this little process that they would work on. Well, or 1 each, sorry. I was using 2 for each ledge district, or each congressional district. So the math but proportionally what I was explaining is the way it works. Now, that's one thing, and that would be legal. In order to do that, you would need to make some pretty big changes. You would really have to have, I think you could probably do it by initiative to the legislature if the legislature was controlled by the Republican Party, arguably, because they'd be the ones who'd be interested in this, then they could pass that as law, and it would become law. However, the other reason in this context that you're bringing this question up, it applies to county voting in Washington state, which is implementing like an electoral college vote approach to the counties. And so So that would say that, if you look at a map of Washington, you have King County voting blue, and Jefferson County, and San Juan County, and a couple other counties that are voting Democrat, and then all the other counties, Lewis County and Cowlitz County and Pacific County and Grays Harbor County and Eastern Washington County, except for Whitman, they're voting Republican. And so if you had an electoral college equivalent in Washington by county, it means that Republicans would typically win the governor's seat in all statewide offices, actually, because they control the majority of the election results would go to a Republican in the majority of these county seats. It would change the dynamics of elections because you'd suddenly have to campaign in all these smaller counties quite a bit more than either party really does now. However, in order to do that, you need a significant change in the state constitution, not a little one, and it would be fought heavily. So I don't see that as being a super likely outcome on the Electoral College side. It could happen on the federal level. I could see a couple scenarios where that would happen. But remember, a vote to approve a constitutional change in Washington State would require not just getting out of the legislature and being signed it, the people would have to vote for it too. And the libs would not like this as a policy, so they would throw everything in the kitchen sink at it. Let's see. Here's one question from Tom Potlatch. I'm assuming that's how you pronounce that. Do you think Washington will gain or lose population as people move for political and cultural reasons? This is a question that people have, and there's a tendency to exaggerate the number of people who move for political reasons. I think people move for financial reasons really consistently. I think they'll move for family reasons, usually pretty consistently. Family, lifestyle, financial. Political is a lot rarer for somebody to move for, at least in any kind of significant numbers. But the question is, how do you draw the line? Because obviously Democrats do a good job destroying the financial future of whatever place they take over. So they destroy the financial future of Illinois or New York and California, and then there's a huge number of people that there's a net exodus from those states. I would argue, though, it's probably more financial than it is specifically political. It just ends up being that way. When you look at the top states where people leave, and they aren't necessarily net departures, but large volume of people who leave, that includes Republican strongholds like Florida and Texas. There's a large number of people that move out of those states every year, and that's statistically truthful. That's just reality. Now, it doesn't tend to create a net immigration exit from those states. So more people are moving in than leaving, but a shockingly large number of people are leaving, and they're not leaving for economic reasons usually. They're leaving for other reasons. And they aren't Democrats leaving and fleeing those states to move to some other jurisdiction. That's not typically, at least the numbers don't show that. So typically, I think what it is people are moving for their own financial reasons, just like they did, yesterday, just like they did 20 years ago, just like they did, 70 years ago, just like they did back in the 30s. One side of my family's been here since the late 1800s, but the other side came here in the late 30s. And they departed, if I remember right, it was Wisconsin that they came out from, and it was purely economic reasons. Their farms weren't doing as well back there, and some of them were interested in going out here to homestead in Alaska, and they stopped in Washington and stayed here. So I think what you'll see is that there's churn that goes on all the time, but the bigger movement when they look at where do people move, any given 100 people so roughly 12% of the U.S. population moves every year. So you break it down, it's about 1% a month that people are moving. But 80% of those moves are moves within the state. So they don't leave the state, they just move somewhere else in the state. And I think you're seeing movement more commonly between urban areas and suburban areas, or somebody's going to move, they still want to stay in the community, but they're upgrading their home, or their family's bigger, they're moving, or they're downsizing, right? And they want to still stay close to their kids, so they're selling their house and they're moving close. That's 80% of it. That is just reality. That is the math. You can pretend like it doesn't happen, but that's the reality. All the data shows that that's how it works. That 20% of the people move out of the state. And why do they move out of the state? Now, some people are going to move for political reasons, and an audience like this where we care about we obsess about politics and we talk about it more, you're probably more likely to know people who would move for those reasons, but that's usually not the only reason they're moving. But it's going to happen. People think that so many Republicans moved to Florida, and that's what's changed Florida's voting results. And I thought that too, actually, until I actually looked at some of the data. What really happened in Florida that affected the voting, they have a ton of people that move in. They also have a huge number of people that move out. They have a net gain in their population each year, or they have recent times pretty consistently gained in population each year, despite the large number of people that move out. So it's really a pretty epic amount of people that are moving in and out. But that's also a big state. There's a large number of people. 11 million people voted in the recent election. However, the big argument or the story that had come out in the paper in Florida was that, there's a huge increasing disparity because in that state, in Florida, they register by party. So you know how many people register with the Democrat Party or the Republican Party. And it used to be that there were more Democrats registered than Republicans in Florida. And now it's the exact opposite by a long ways. Like there's a huge number of a bigger gap with registered Republicans in Florida than there has been in forever. It isn't because the Democrats moved out of Florida. What's happened is they just started cleaning up the rolls for the first time. And if you look at the net registered Republicans, it's increased over the last 4 years, but not by that much. At 11 million votes, an increase of about 100,000 voters or 115,000, I think, Republican voters isn't that big of a difference. What was a big difference was the decrease of 850,000 Democrats or so off the voter rolls, and it wasn't because they moved, it was because they didn't exist and the voter rolls were just corrupted and bad. And when I look at even the Washington state election results that are published right now, that are finalized, or at least the numbers the Secretary of State has finalized, you see about the same number of people voted for Trump this year as they did 4 years ago. It's about the same. It's a lot bigger than it was 8 years ago, but it's about the same as it was 4 years ago. And it's a little bit less, but there's also about the same percentage less. It's a little bit even more dramatic on the Democrat side. There's fewer Democrats voting this cycle than there were 4 years ago. Now, does that mean that all the Democrats left Washington state? It doesn't. But it does mean that not a lot has changed in 4 years. So why would people move to Washington? They're going to move here because it's probably not an attraction to the rain or the weather. It could be a little bit. If you're moving from Minnesota, it seems pretty mild out here, or Wisconsin, which is why we had so many people immigrate from Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan over the years. But that's probably not the main reason why somebody would leave. It is pretty mild on the west side of the state in comparison, but they are definitely moving here for jobs. They moved here for jobs in World War I heavily because of the shipbuilding industry and timber industry that was out here. Timber and fishing and all that stuff, agriculture really did drive a lot of the migration to Washington in the 1800s, all the way up probably through, I would say, the 1930s a little bit. And shipbuilding was also a big deal. And when Boeing came in and started set up, and we became a mecca for airplanes, that was another big surge in the west side of the state anyway. And you had other little localized reasons, increasing agricultural expansion in Wenatchee or someplace. You'd have these things that would happen. But and then, of course, the tech boom that came around in the late 70s all the way running through till now. Now, if the Democrats have been successful in destroying the economic aspirations of some of the tech companies, then that's going to be the biggest impact that you'll have in Washington state for people leaving the state will be because of the tech boom collapse. What's the profile of the average tech worker? Just as a hint, they probably aren't Republican. So if they decide to leave because there's an economic downturn at Amazon or Microsoft or some of these other tech companies, and they decide they're going to start leaving the state, then you're going to see it'll look like a political shift, but it's really decisions based on economics. Washington has always been especially Western Washington, it's been a desirable place to live for many. It's a mild climate. It's got a lot of water. We don't have the shortages of water that you do in the Southwest. We don't have the humidity that you do in the Southeast. And we don't have the hardcore winters that you do in the Midwest and the Northeast. So there's going to be people coming to the Puget Sound region probably for a lot of reasons. But we'll see, and we'll see what happens. But it's a good question, and I didn't really get a chance to answer that completely. But let's see. Let me jump in here. I'm going to answer a couple more questions, and then I'll call it a night because I realize I'm pushing my time again. Jason, question, what's your opinion on possibly having light rail from Portland to Vancouver, and what are the ups and downs? In my opinion, it's all down. Having light rail in Vancouver is a nightmare. That's just Portland trying to export their failures and dump their costs of the collapse and failures of the TriMet system and dump it into Washington so that we get to pick up a bigger piece of the tab for less value. And so I think the idea of light rail is a terrible one, and I think that we should do anything and everything we can to prevent it from crossing over the river, just like we should try to prevent the fentanyl and drug addicts from crossing over from Portland, too. It'd just be a good idea if we just didn't have that there. Let's see. Will Penny in New York be defaulted like Trump and Alex Jones in civil trial in retaliation for being acquitted? I think what you're talking about is somebody going after him civilly. I don't know. I mean, he has a civil lawsuit already filed against him, but, it's the dad of the criminal who basically ignored his own son, and the only time he cared about his son was when his son's dead, and he can use it as a way to get money. So I don't know that you're going to see that same result from that, but we'll have to see. Let's see. And Garama Crafts, since we have to declare our party in Washington State, that we're choosing a party, how can this be constitutional if voting is supposed to be anonymous? Okay, I think you're conflating a couple different things. So number one, we don't register as a party in Washington. We don't. We haven't since the 1930s. That's why we had kind of the blanket primary process in the past before we went to the top two primary system we have now. And so since you're not having to declare your party registration, there is only one time every 4 years that you indicate how you're voting, which is whether you participate, because you're not allowed to participate in the Democrat primary and in the Republican primary when there's a presidential primary. So every 4 years. And the Secretary of State, in its infinite idiocy, decided that recently, a few cycles ago, that they would have, during the presidential primary and only that election, that they would have you indicate on the outside whether these ballots are going into the Republican primary or the Democrat primary. So even though they can already kind of tell if you vote in one party or one party primary or the other, they can't tell how you voted, and all they can tell is that you 4 years ago, or the last three cycles, you would see that Glen Morgan voted in the Republican primary and not in the Democrat primary. But you won't know how I voted necessarily. So that's all you can tell. It's anonymous in the sense that you can't tell how I voted. You certainly have no idea how I voted down ticket, but because we're only really talking about the presidential primary, that's like the one window in Washington. And the reason why they do that is that they can't have you voting in multiple parties' primaries. I have friends that voted purposely in the Democrat primary so that, because they had a mark on the outside of the ballots, they decided they would just vote in the Democrat primary even though they voted Republican in the general. Let's see. Donald Larson, yeah, your story right here, Donald, about moved from Florida here in 2018, cost us literally 4 times Florida. My salary went down in Washington. Financially devastating, so I'm coming back. Well, yeah, so that's the main reason why people move both places. Let's see. Last question here. Highlands of Lowlands. At We the Governed, happy greetings from Lopez Island. Are you following the brand new tax that our San Juan County Council has invented and is pushing? They win every time. Working hard here. Thank you. I don't know which tax you're talking about because San Juan County does invent a lot of crazy taxes. So I'm not sure which ones you're actually talking about, but please let me know. And if I can't answer it now, I'll try to get the information so that I can answer it next week. With that, guys, I've kind of hit my time allotment. I actually originally told myself when I was doing these live streams, I was only going to do them for an hour, and I tend to do them for about an hour 15, an hour 20. I'm not purposely just trying to make them longer. It's just that usually people kind of start ramping up the questions towards the end of the program, and it becomes more engaged and involved answering those questions then. So I hope that today's live stream is helpful. I thank everybody for logging on. It's been busy getting ready for the holidays. I don't know about you, but I have my kids. A couple of my kids are coming back from college. One's coming back from the Air Force Academy. I believe I have another child that's graduating this year, going to the Air Force Academy next year too. So possibly two of them. So we'll see how it is. I have twins that are graduating. It's a big time of year. So this is a big holiday for us. First time a couple of our kids, they both left the home last year and they're coming back this year. So it's kind of a big deal for our family. I hope that if I don't see you sooner, that you have a good time at Christmas. I will be doing a live stream next week for sure. And if I get my act together so I can start having some of my testing out some of this new equipment that was donated to me, I may be doing some live streams from a different location that's not here at the studio. And we'll see how well that works over the Christmas holidays. And I'm hoping that I get your feedback on that. Thanks for all your questions here. Thanks for your comments on my video channel. If you've been paying attention, and no reason you should be, but we've picked up about 4,000 more subscribers in the last couple weeks. So we've had a big increase. I don't know how they changed their algorithm now to to restrict our channel viewership a little bit. So it's opened up a little bit more, and so we are getting a little bit more subscribers coming through, which is good. I think that just spreads the word out there more. I've been approached in public many times in a lot of random places. If you are watching right now and you were the guy that came up to me at the Pilot gas station, or you had come up to me at Costco, or you came up to me at Walmart, or if you came up to me at Fred Meyer's, anytime recently, I want to thank you for telling me how much you like the show and just give me that personal feedback. It's much more interesting than just talking to a camera here in the studio. And everybody that I saw Sunday at this event with the Epoch Times, thank you so much for inviting me there. Thanks for talking to me afterwards. Had a lot of good conversations. And I look forward to seeing you guys next week. Watch my videos. I got 3 of them coming out this week after this show, and they'll be sequentially going up. Hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Share it with your friends and show them over the holidays if they haven't done that as well. Just getting the word out here more just helps get the word out to a larger audience and hopefully more impactful. So with that, guys, thank you so much, and I will see you next week.